do we now have the first major scandal? The first big screw-up of the Trump administration? Well, for the past week, Washington has been absolutely abuzz with the story of what turned out to be the group chat from hell when 18 Trump administration's officials got on the encrypted messaging app Signal to discuss their plans to strike at Houthi forces in Yemen. A lot of big players on the chat: Vice President J.D. Vance, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, a bunch of others too. But there was just one problem. There was some genius, and we'll talk about that a bit later on, added the editor of The Atlantic, Jeffrey Goldberg, presumably by mistake, and this was done by someone either in the chat or one of their staffers. So, great work there, because Goldberg, who is a hard-left anti-Trump journo, was able to listen into the discussion for at least a day and see what may have not only been classified information, and it was at least secret stuff according to plenty of analyses I've seen, but also published sledges about the Europeans who in the chat were called freeloaders and worse. Well, I mean, that's probably no worse than what French waiters have to say about Americans when they're on their smoke breaks, but here we are. Anyway, there have been a lot of attempts by the White House to excuse the incident, but suggestions that this was all just a setup, that sort of thing, sorry, the fact of the matter is this was a screw-up. Not a hanging offense, but definitely a mistake born of the fact that this is still an administration, it's hard to forget this, that's new to the game. Now, Signal, you may be familiar with it, is a great app for encrypted messaging, but its use also threatens various legislation that requires the keeping of records by government officials. And there's more, because if you dig into what Signal, which is regularly used and considered about the most secure of all the easily available messaging apps, well, what it's all about, there are also concerns about whether it can be gotten into via various back doors used by agencies such as the CIA and FBI, agencies that, if we're frank about it, are not all that friendly to Trump. But that said, is this really the end of the world? No. Is it a warning to be more careful, use properly scrambled phones and secure compartmentalized information facilities to talk about war plans? Absolutely. And I would add, though, that this is also another one of those incidents whereby, in trying to make this into something more than it is, Trump's enemies have wound up once again going too far and making themselves seem ridiculous. I mean, remember, there have been plenty of times when revealing classified information was considered something the left absolutely cheered, or at least waved on. In 1971, a case over the leaked top-secret Pentagon papers revealing truths about the conduct of the Vietnam War, well, that was celebrated by the left. It went to the Supreme Court. The New York Times gleefully published it all as an act of patriotism. More recently, Hillary Clinton would get pinged for using a private email server that many criticized as being vulnerable to Russian or Chinese penetration to get around government record-keeping requirements. But at the time, the left laughed it all off, saying it was no big deal, sarcastically saying, "Oh, but her emails." And in the last Trump administration, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman was also celebrated for revealing the secret contents of a call between Donald Trump and Vladimir Zelensky of Ukraine, the contents of which were used to drive one of the many Russiagate probes. So it seems as though the attitude towards whether classified information is better off in the public domain does seem a bit opportunistic to me. Now, personally, I think all classified and top-secret stuff should stay that way and be protected, even if the government also uses these sorts of classification rules to protect itself from scrutiny. That's another bad practice that needs stamping out. But this is why, while I ultimately think this is a terrible screw-up, it's pretty fair for the administration to close ranks, not play their enemies' game, and not, so far, give them a scalp, especially when those hammering the administration were so, well, blasé about having a man who was non-compos mentis in the Oval Office for 4 years.
I think this whole thing is a total joke in the sense that You guys have asked me more questions in the last 2 days about this than President Autopin not having the mental capacity to make decisions as Commander-in-Chief. There was no investigation there. Lloyd Austin was missing in action, didn't tell anybody, including the Commander-in-Chief, that he was in the hospital. So this whole thing is basically a function of the fact that the Democrats got their asses whooped in November.
Very fair points from Republican Senator Eric Schmidt there, but for a master class in turning this narrative back around to the Democrats, check out Veterans Affairs Secretary Doug Collins torching CNN's Caitlin Collins. No relation, obviously.
Do you believe that a mistake was made here, though, to have this conversation, to add a reporter, and to have it on an unsupported, classified group setting?
Caitlin, as I've just told you, I've just answered the question. I wasn't part of it. And, I'm not going to speculate more than what the president's already talked about and those who've been involved have talked about. But we'd love to talk about the veterans.
Yeah, and I do have questions about the veterans. But given what we saw with the group chat and how this was used, you are a member of the cabinet. You obviously know these other members, several of them who were in there. Is this typical for the cabinet to have conversations over Signal? Is this something that you use?
Well, Caitlin, Senator, you undoubtedly do not want to talk about the VA. I have a question as VA Secretary. As Cabinet, I want to ask you, because I've been curious about this, because my job is to take care of veterans, and I would like to know why CNN is hostile to veterans, especially one in Florida, where you just had a $5 million defamation suit taking offense at a veteran who was trying to help people. In fact, one of your employees actually said, we're going to nail him. I have a question for you, Caitlin. Is that employee still employed?
And that's what it comes down to. That's how it's done. Now, again, the Signal chat was a screw-up. They shouldn't have done it, and at some point, they'll get to the bottom of how this whole thing happened. But the faux outrage of those who think this is it, they finally got Trump now, spare me.